Thank you, everyone, for a very warm welcome. It is really quite lovely to be here. It's twice in Toronto in just in the space of a couple of months, so that's been kind of fun. As Chris said, yes, I am a Linux kernel engineer. I've been working on the kernel for about 12 years. I've done a number of things. A lot of them have been embedded. I ran a small embedded engineering company and got involved with helping to maintain device tree. At Lenaro, I was working in the office of the CTO, which was a really neat place to work because I got to see a lot of different areas of the industry. Got to talk with both business and engineering community members, and just kind of see where everyone's thinking. And now Hewlett Packard convinced me to come on board, and I'm helping HP with their Linux strategy for the new products coming up. But this morning, what I want to talk about, we have video, excellent. This morning, what I'd like to talk about, I'm not here on behalf of Hewlett Packard, I'm here very much as a community member. As you know, we are part of this shared engineering community, and I want to talk a little bit about this. And when Chris invited me to come, and I took a look at the presentation, at the topic for the conference, I thought, you know what, that's actually a really compelling topic to do a keynote on. So, resistance was futile. Now what? So I'd like to take an attempt at seeing if I can answer that question, or answer the now what question. But I feel like answering now what is really hard to do without first talking about the resistance was futile. What does that mean? Well, to start with, why don't we take a very quick tour of the history of open source. I found this picture, this timeline, on a blog. One of the Red Hat product managers had put this together, but I had already been thinking in these terms. We're looking back from 2016, we're looking back at about 50 years of software development. We're looking back at a history that started with the first computers where the norm had been basically open source software. It had been the people who had computers, who had access to the few computers that there were, by just matter of course, they were sharing their code with all the people who were involved, and it was very much a collaborative effort. Things started to change somewhere around the 1970s, 1980s, when software was unbundled from hardware, and it became less and less common for the source code for software to be shipped with the binaries. We saw the companies start to realize that software has an awful lot of value, and there really is the quickest way to take advantage of that value is to start following a bit of a proprietary model and try to sell software as it was a product, as you sell other kinds of products. And this is what we start to see the proprietary software market form. But in the meantime, what suffered as part of that is the open source free software mindset. It wasn't called that at the time, but that started to go away in preference for people using the commercial software that they were buying. But we still have examples. Like, you take a look at BSD, that was happening at the same time. That was still being distributed as source. We all know the very famous story of Richard Stallman getting really pissed off at a printer driver that wasn't working and not having access to the source, and that being a bit of the catalyst for his thinking around software freedom, and not just whether or not the source is distributed, but what does it mean that we're giving source away? What does it mean for us as society if we are sharing source? And then we come around to the 90s, where we start to see a resurgence, and Linus published his kernel project in about 91. We saw a whole bunch of interest and gains and collaboration going on through the 90s, until through to the 2000s, we're suddenly in a period where proprietary software is giving way in a big way to free software again. And in a lot of ways, we've kind of come full circle. We haven't been on a journey of proprietary software giving way to open source, but we've gone open source through a period of proprietary software and then coming right back to where we were at the beginning with free software. To the point now where 99% of businesses have free software as part of their kind of core, integrated to the core of what they do. So, let's talk about resistance is futile. So it's kind of a provocative title. So, first of all, resistance is futile. What does this actually mean? I'd like to kind of, let's boil this down. Let's go back to first principles and ask some basic questions on this. So, first of all, if we're talking about resistance was futile, who was resisting? What exactly were they resisting against? Or perhaps better, perhaps more accurately, is, what were they resisting against and who were they resisting against? Now, from context, I think it's kind of safe to say that, or we could say, we as the free software community is what was being resisted against. But I have to admit that that's a pretty vague term. If we talk about us and them, or we talk about us, and the term that we use being community, that term is very vague. What does the community consist of? The obvious answer is to say that the community is the people who can contribute to a project. Oops. So let's actually take a look at this. Linux Weekly News has done a number of articles that talk about who contributes to the kernel. So I went and took a look at some of the numbers myself. If we take a look at who's contributing to the kernels, the first place is the engineers. Who are the engineers actually working? Now I'm going to take this from the perspective, I'm going to use the Linux kernel as a case study for free software. The kernel definitely doesn't encompass all of open source and free software, but it's a really good case study because there's been so many people who've been looking at it and researching it. And quite frankly, as I was putting this keynote together, it was the easiest place to go get numbers. So the first thing to look at is the engineers. And I decided to look at, for each kernel release, how many individual email addresses representing individual contributors were involved. And the numbers were quite staggering. I mean, we started out back in the 2.6, I only went back to 2.6.30. I could have gone back further, but at 2.6.30, we have about 1,300 unique developers contributing patches to every single release. We have, now this by the way, I haven't accounted for duplicate email addresses, so this is not going to be a totally accurate number, but it's pretty close. So we've got about 1,300 on the 2.6.30, and then once we get up to, we've seen a steady increase up to around the 1,700 mark for the 4.8 release a few months ago, or a month ago. This is a lot of people. This is a very large net that we're casting when we're talking about community. But is it fair to talk just about the developers who contribute patches when we're talking about community? And I don't really think it is, because we're also talking about those people who are reviewing, those people who are testing, those people who aren't necessarily going to show up on the commit statistics. So the next thing I wanted to look at was, or just another view of the same data. I had said that there was about 1,400, but that didn't account for how many actually unique developers or how many carry over. When I actually aggregated it and collected how many individual developers unique over the whole period of time, how that increased over time, we're adding about 300 new unique contributors every kernel cycle. Every 3 months, there's another 300 people who show up, contribute probably just one patch, but still they're contributing. The net just got wider. I've got, I think, 15,000 people just on the kernel alone. And that's not taking into account user space. That's not taking into account the big projects like OpenStack. Still, I don't think I've got a wide enough net. The next thing that I went to look at is the companies that are involved. I mean, we all know that corporations have gotten an incredible amount of value and an awful lot of, being a hobbyist Linux kernel developer is something that tends not to last very long. Because those developers who get out there, who get involved with the project, who start contributing to the project, they tend to get jobs really quickly. And you get companies that are involved. Well, in the concept of community, those companies, those employers are going to have influence over the project. They're going to have an effect on what we value in the project. So again, I'm not going to call out individual companies because you've seen those statistics before, I'm sure, on Linux Weekly News, but I wanted to look just at the raw aggregate numbers. Just like the developers, where we've got around 1,300 developers every month, we've got around 300 unique companies participating in every single kernel release. So my point in going through this and talking about the numbers and the number of people that are involved is that if we talk about community, we try to talk about community as if it's this monolithic thing. We try to talk about it as if that we all believe exactly the same thing, or that we have the same goals. And that with how big we are, with how many people are involved, that clearly is not the case. And that there's a lot of people with very different goals and very different intents. So that begs the question, what is it that actually ties us together and pulls us together? So to take the Star Trek analogy a little bit further, the conference title is Resistance Was Futile. And that kind of gives in the Star Trek analogy, that is assimilation, that we are all being assimilated into the community. But when I was thinking about it and putting this together, I thought that, well, I'm not sure assimilation is quite the concept that we're talking about here. Because really what we're talking about is we are growing the tent, we are growing the net of who is involved in the community. We have people and companies coming in that have their own motivations and goals for why they want to participate on the software. And we are working together and collaborating to figure out how to do shared projects that support all of those goals. And so in my mind, when we talk about resistance was futile, this isn't a statement of conquest, that we have gone and conquered the world in free software. But it is a statement of partnership, where we have been able to partner and change the minds of how viable open source is, and bring in a lot of companies that originally were really not interested in free software. Example. I try to tell stories when I'm doing a keynote, because us as humans, when we're looking at these concepts, it's the stories that really kind of resonate and tell us, and that we attach to and to understand what we're seeing. Let's go back into Linux history when, mid-90s, when Linux was really picking up and was starting to challenge a lot of the incumbent proprietary industries. We started to have some, we got into a bit of a spat with a certain large software company in Redmond, Washington. Now, when nasty words were bandied about, like, cancer or, communist, just horrible things were said, and, to be honest, horrible things were said on our side. We kind of cheered a little bit when Microsoft, when open source won a contract that Microsoft wasn't able to get. And things were really, there's a lot of animosity, okay? Microsoft, for a lot of us, ended up embodying everything that was evil about the corporate software world. And there was we never, ever want to work with Microsoft. We want Microsoft to die a horrible death and go away so that free software can take over the world. But an interesting thing happened. If you look back in the last couple of years and you look around Linux conferences, you'll notice an awful lot of Microsoft people around. When you go and look at the kernel contributions, Microsoft is at a respectable place on the kernel contributions and also in the other projects. Microsoft ships Linux software. They ship Ubuntu with Windows, parts of Ubuntu with Windows 10. They are working on their Linux support for Azure and supporting it in their platform. Things have turned around entirely that Microsoft, by the criteria that we were just talking about, we have to consider Microsoft as part of the community. And for some of us, that's a little bit galling. It's like, oh wait, but I was really committed to being angry at them. But we've seen a change. And I think this is what I mean when I say that the resistance was futile is not a statement of conquest, it is a statement of participation, and that we have been able to change the conversation. That all these companies that were vehemently opposed to anything that was free software because they didn't see how, they didn't fit with their business model, have changed their minds and have seen the value. So, if that's our community, and if we've got this vast array, so many different viewpoints in terms of why, motivations on why we're involved with Linux, how do we ever work together? How do we ever come to agreement on what free, how do we come to agreement? How do we keep from tearing each other's throats out when we're trying to work out problems that are differences of value? So, okay. So, in another aspect, this kind of sounds like a stupid question to ask, how do we work together? Because the other side of the coin is, well, we've been doing it. We've been doing it for 25 years of Linux, and it's been successful. But if you look back again, that 25 years is also full of a lot of work and a lot of strife and a lot of figuring things out of how we work together. Because I think that there was a lot of that it's easy to start making the assumptions of we all have the same viewpoint and the same motivations without talking about it and then not realizing that we don't have the same motivations. We end up treating free software as cultural knowledge, and I think that we have to still keep talking about it. Because if starting a new project and we just try to sprinkle magic pixie dust over the project, we're going to end up with a bunch of developers coming in having very different expectations of what the project actually is. And that's just setting ourselves up for strife. I'll give you here's an example that came up very recently. You may have seen the news of ArduPilot, and Andrew Tridgell was put this was part of a blog post that he put on the ArduPilot website just in September. Now, what happened here is that there was a project spun up that joined together several different projects that were doing drone software. One of them was ArduPilot, PX4 was another one, and there was a number of hobbyists that were in there. There was a number of companies that were involved, and everyone was quite excited about this because this was a chance that all of these players were going to be involved in the same way. And then a couple of years later, we end up with this on the coming up on the ArduPilot blog. And so let me be clear here. I'm not going to bring this up to point fingers at the project or anything like this, but I want to highlight something that I noticed when this news broke. And so here's the statement, part of the statement. The structure and bylaws are built around exceptional power for Platinum members, giving them extraordinary control over the future of drone code. This is a fundamental flaw in a project meant to promote free and open source software, as it means that the business interests of a very small number of members can override the interests of the rest of the members and the community. Now, I'm not involved with this project. I don't have any direct involvement with this here, so I'm not going to, this is not to vilify anyone who is involved. But what I hear from that statement is that there was a distinct mismatch of what the expectations were. Now, I can easily assume that the folks that made the decisions, to them, it looked like a good idea. Perhaps they have commercial products that they want to ship, that it was easier from a legal point of view to ship those products if they made these decisions. But the problem is that the decisions that were made, whether or not they were malicious, I'm not going to go there, but the decisions that were made the ArduPilot developers feel excluded. It excluded them from made them feel like their contributions weren't valued, made it feel like control over the project was being pulled away from them. And I think that situations, this is just one example. We see it in other cases, and I think it's where we don't actually talk about what projects don't necessarily talk about what they value, and don't notice until much later when there's a mismatch between their values. I mean, you may say that this is, why are we talking about this? This is interpersonal issues. But I go back to my own history when I think about this. Years back, I was working for a Canadian company, Computing Devices Canada in Calgary. I was junior engineer. I was working on a new project. It was some test softwares for some cool hardware. I was having a great deal of fun. I was pouring my heart and soul into this project. It was going great, and then one day it was canceled. Just the business had gone away, and that project was done, and that whole code base was just done. It was gone. And okay, so I was an employee. I was paid. I always knew that the deal was this was code I was doing for the company. Sorry. Well, it was a government contract, so maybe. It was, but I also, unexpectedly found myself going through grief, right? That code that I had poured my own intensity, excitement, energy into was no longer something that I had access to. And that became a big part of my thinking when I became familiar with open source, is that the involvement with a project is not the way that I'm involved with the project. Being involved with free software, a big part of that is being part of a project that I can be part of a long term, that I can have that attachment to. And I think talking with other developers, this is where I figured out, where I finally understood when I heard other developers talk about code being expression, being artistic expression even, because it is something that we have an emotional attachment to. Why am I bringing this up in a conference where most of our talk is going to be about the technical projects that we're working on? Because I think it's important when we're talking about community to realize that we as humans are not these intellectual automatons that are completely logical and always make the best intellectual decisions. As if we have, we're bodies, or we're minds that are kind of carried around by these bodies. I mean, modern psychology, it shows we're not that. We are embodied. We have minds and bodies, and our emotions are very much a part of the way that we make decisions. If emotions weren't a big part of this, then why did we have so many fights in the open source world? Why did we have so many flame wars on the Linux kernel mailing list if people weren't emotionally attached to the work that we're doing? So, to talk about this, what's become a big deal for me is to start thinking about the way that we construct projects. I am serving on the Linux Foundation's Technical Advisory Board. And so I served for a brief period of time as the chair of the board, so I was also sitting on the Linux Foundation Board of Directors. And I was able to see kind of some of the decisions and discussions that were being made on how new projects are getting set up. One of the things that comes up a lot is licensing. And we talk about licensing a bit. We've spent an awful lot of time arguing about what licenses mean. There's court cases that have gone on, is the GPL actually enforceable in court? What does the BSD license mean in terms of patents? How do you best manage a project? And I think that this is very important. All the legal aspects of licensing and the instrumental view, what does the license do? How does that functionally work when we're using the project? But that's only half the topic. The other half is that licensing is very much, when you choose a license for a project, you have to remember that that license also communicates something to the rest of the project, to your potential contributors, of what that project, what you value, what the project values, what the contributors' contributions are going to be, how they're going to be valued. In the same way, we've got contributor licensing agreements. That's going to communicate something to your contributors on what about what you value. And so what I've been encouraging is, when you look at licenses, what does it say to your developers? Now, we've got a number of free software licenses. I'm actually a really big fan. I'm a really big proponent of the GPL for this exact reason. There's, I think, a lot of tendency to move towards permissive licensing because, from the instrumental point of view, it gives you the maximum amount of benefit, or it gives you the maximum amount of leeway to do what you want with the minimum amount of risk. But at the same time, you have the risk of communicating to your contributors that their contributions don't actually matter. Or even worse, communicating that we want your contributions and we want to take them without having to show you any of the work that we're doing. And I think that you need to, I'm not saying that you must do copyleft licensing, but it has to be aware of that when you're choosing a project or choosing licensing for a project, how that is going to affect the people that you are going to be contributing. Now, I won't, I was going to say that. In terms of these licenses as value statement, here's a little bit of, oh, that's not the right slide. If you look at the licenses, right in the text, for example, of the GPL, you'll see that the language that's being used right there is value statements. Free software is, one of the value statements from the GNU public license, or general public license, is this language of freedom, which is a value statement. Now, I won't talk any more about this. Cory Doctorow has done a much, much better job of it. He gave a keynote at LinuxCon this year, and he called Lock It Open, which I strongly encourage to go and watch. And he talked about free software licensing, Apache, BSD, and GPL, how as we choose the licensing, this is how we really took over the world, is because we got the code out into the open in a way that is irrevocable. There we go, I got the word out. Okay, so that was an awful lot of time setting background, which then comes to, okay, what's next? Well, in my mind, what's next is actually an awful lot of what we're doing right now. It's really easy to portray free software and open source software as battling against the proprietary world. And that's really never what it's been about. There has been a battle against the proprietary world. There has been a really strong battle for relevance, to say that we have a right to be here, that we have a right to have access to hardware so that we can write software and run it without having to get around locks on the hardware. And we've got that. We've got the relevance now. But that was a sideshow to do what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do as a community was develop great software. We want to collaborate to build great things. We want to get software out there so that other people could take it and do crazy stuff that we never thought about in the first place. And I think that's what's next, is we get on with that. And in the midst of getting on with that, we have some very significant challenges that we have to deal with right now. All of you will be familiar, I'm sure, a few days ago of the major outage on the internet that was caused by current speculation right now is it's a script kiddie who managed to get a large a number of botnets of compromised Internet of Things devices. Now, this is where the challenge, I think, comes for us next, is now that we have relevance, we're not worried about that, we're on to the next big things of not only how do we work on our individual projects, how do those projects work together? How do we build a system that is robust from a security point of view? How do we build systems that are robust from a personal communication, personal data, control of your own data? So, and that's the challenge, is to go out there, keep writing great software, and that's it. So thank you very much. Any questions? Okay. Hold on. Oh, where's the mic?
Actually,
I'll just repeat the question. Okay, go ahead.
You said at the beginning that the software was free, and then we went through a cycle of proprietary software. Now we're back full circle to
Yes.
open source. But what's the situation now with cell phones? I get the feeling that with Google and Apple, that maybe we're drifting back
That is a major problem.
to the old days.
Yep. Yes. Well, and so we have won in terms of everything is based on free software, but that doesn't mean the same that everything is open. And so that's absolutely right, is there are, big areas of issue right now. I mean, DRM is huge right now, the locking down of media, and it's everywhere. And that's going to be a significant challenge, because it's going to lock out, even if the software is all free, it's going to lock out actually being able to use the software. And then you're right, there is the appliance devices. Now, I think that I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about the lockdown of software on those devices. I'm also hopeful, and I'm hopeful because things are going to get really awful before they get better. So that's a kind of a funny statement to make. The reason I think things are going to get really awful before they get better is companies are technical or Internet of Things companies are really good at turning out devices. They're really good at putting a device out that it gets on the internet and does something. But security on those things is horrible. Most of those companies are fly-by-night. Most of those companies don't have any kind of, they're not able to support the devices that are out there. The same thing goes for the cell phone manufacturers. It's two sides of the same coin. What I think is going to happen is that the companies are going to realize that they can't be the full software stack developers anymore, that they just can't do it, right? Because they don't have the resources to support. So if that's the case, then what does an operating system look like for cell phones and Internet of Things devices that separates the hardware manufacturer who's running at a really low margin from a company or organization that is maintaining the software stack? And I think what we're going to see, I think what the industry is going to be forced towards is having that separation, which then gets us away from these lockdown devices. It means that we're going to see Internet of Things devices and cell phones over time look more like the PC market, where the operating system is separated from the device. I'm hopeful with this with Google, because Google has all these cell phone partners that are building their own hardware, and Google gets blamed for all of the security issues. So a partner, an OEM produces a handset. That handset, they ship the kernel for that handset. Google depends entirely on that vendor to ship updates to that kernel. And yet, Google's the one with the security problem, because they're the one with the ecosystem that is broken. And I think what Google's going to have to do is they're going to have to become a distribution. That's my personal opinion. But I think it's something we have to keep working towards, is fixing the problem of lockdown devices. So, other questions?
I think your analysis there is spot on, but I also think we won't get a better world until we have the customers understand what they're buying. And I don't mean in the sense that they have to write kernel code. I mean, because the device is shiny and new today, doesn't mean it's going to be working in 6 months or a year, and the customers don't really understand that. And when they do understand it, they say, oh, the life cycle of a phone is 2 years, I'll throw it out after 2 years. The customer should ask for better. I got a phone call I had to leave. The service department of my car dealer phone. I have a 22-year-old car. I never would have had a 22-year-old car 25 years ago. The cars have improved in
Mhm.
longevity. I think we've got to teach people to expect more on the life cycle of their product, and that's going to drive open source, multiple providers, and all those sorts of things. That's my
Yeah.
guess. I'm already providing an answer, but the real thing is the question. How can we get more discerning consumers? That's the big driver.
I agree. I don't know how to do that. I think that if products stop working, obviously, there's going to, consumers will notice that. But our current situation is we don't have products that fail noticeably. When there's, with the security issues, when you've got compromised devices that still appear to work, or they work slower, customers aren't necessarily going to know that that's how to fix that or what to demand of their consumers. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think you are right, and I think that's one of the things we're going to need to work out. Oh, sorry.
Key to your Linux on the desktop.
It's on my desktop.
Case closed.
To respond to his question, it sounds like you might have been saying that your average consumer is ignorant. Not necessarily means that it's stupid, but they're just ignorant of what their device is actually capable of. And that what there is out there, and because of their limited exposure to products, because they rely on mainstream commercialization to tell them what's there, they don't know that there's other options. They don't know that their device is capable of more than what they have.
Yeah, I would agree. Absolutely. Any other questions? I've been looking at this side of the room. Any over here? Okay, it's you.
You previously gave the example of, was it Arduino Pilot?
Yes.
Where the community felt that a select elite few members or contributors
Yes.
had a disproportionate influence.
Yes.
So I guess those elite few members, they were also contributors though, either in money or in code or in other resources.
Yes. Yes.
I want to contrast that though with the end of your presentation where you give the example of the Internet of Things exploits. We had the recent denial of service attacks that were on the security researcher Brian Krebs, and then later on Twitter and on Amazon, and they were very, very effective. So I'm wondering your opinion on security versus freedom. Is it possible to have both, or are they both kind of two ends of the same line and you have to sacrifice one for the other?
That's a really good question. So the question is, security and freedom, are they on the same line? I don't have a simple answer to that one. I've got some interesting, complicated answers. So I think being able to do both security and freedom is possible. It requires creativity. It requires thinking about the problem in a different way. So I had a very interesting conversation with one of my friends who's looking at security at the LF. And he brought up that there is a contrast, like the way that we do security with cell phones right now is we lock down we've got a root file system that's locked down. We sign the kernel, we sign the root file system, and that's how we know that we can boot. But what do we do about the data? And the current model, let's see if I can remember this correctly. The current model, the data is tied to the user account. Although my information may be a little bit out of date here. But what he was talking about is that one of the ways that we can handle the functionality of secure boot is we can make use of the security features to actually enable freedom and keep the security. So for example, if a vendor ships a kernel and a root file system and the security portion of the device uses that to the signature of the kernel, of the company that signs the kernel, to unlock other keys, right? So when you provision the device, you get a root file system, you get a data partition that is locked to a key, but that key is only released based on the kernel that's booted. So the data is, you've got a fully protected system. But if you as a user go, I'm going to take control over my device, I'm going to uninstall the vendor key, or just leave it in place, but I'm going to install my own key. And I'm going to sign my own kernel, I'm going to sign my own root file system, and I'm going to put that on the device. So now I've got the ability to run code on the device. But the security, the TPM won't release the key for the old data partition. Right? But that's okay, because I'm going to create a new data partition. And so there's innovative ways that we can create secure devices that for users who aren't going to go through those hoops, who want it to, when it comes out of the box, they trust their vendor, and they want to be able to use the device, it works. But at the same time, the device is usable by those who want to take control for either because they personally value that, or because of their corporate environment that they're working in, or any other reasons why they might want to take control over a device. I thought one of the most interesting things that's happened over the last year is all the kerfuffle over secure boot, where Microsoft came up with, Microsoft pushed for secure boot, and there was a huge hubbubaloo in our community about, is secure boot a good thing? And this is Microsoft's attempt to lock us out. I can't speak for Microsoft as a whole. I can speak for a few engineers who talked to me afterwards that, in Microsoft said that wasn't our intent. But at the end of it, the conversation went from Microsoft is trying to lock us out to secure boot is a useful feature that we can use free software to build secure systems that we ourselves have control over. And that's the conversation that I think needs to happen.
2 points on that. First of all, Microsoft has locked us out of the RT hardware with security.
They have locked us out of the RT hardware, yes.
So it absolutely, and if the kerfuffle hadn't happened, they might have locked us out of PCs. We never will know.
And we have to be careful about treating corporations as monolithic,
Yeah.
right? So there's, I have great support for parts of Microsoft that are really invested in open source. There's other parts of Microsoft that I'm sure are looking at the way to do things from a very different lens, where it makes sense to lock things down. And we do need to keep bringing that up and keep doing the same things that we've been doing all along, of pointing out where there are design decisions or business decisions that impede the ability to run free software.
No, I had a bigger point, but I just want to throw in another little nit. If I'm correct, I seem to remember Microsoft contributions to the kernel are 90% to support Hyper-V.
That is correct.
Of their products. So
That's correct.
Not really altruistic. It's a good thing.
So what about Citrix submitting patches to support Zen?
Right, I think that's also,
Yeah.
it's a lot of companies do that. But
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my bigger point was really back a few steps. Security is a very complicated
Yes.
field, and it isn't, one word doesn't cover it. A classic example of how misleading it is, these SD cards you have.
Yes.
The S stands for secure.
Mhm.
And you know who it's secure from?
Media vendors, I believe.
The user.
Yes.
It secures media content from the user.
Mhm.
So who would put that in a name if the customer knew it was against them?
Mm-hmm.
Really? That's how goofy the word security is in our lingo.
Very overloaded term.
Yes.
So
I would claim security requires open source, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some code that I wrote in the security field is actually, and is open source, has actually been used by NSA, for instance. So open source, they think passes muster.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Here.
Isn't this the whole mantra of open source speaking about Microsoft and Hyper-V and all that? spread your own inch, going back to Linux, going back to the freedom driver and features panel. So
Yeah.
what's the big deal? Actually, that's a very good thing.
I think so. I mean, we've got loads of evidence that scratching your own itch, doing the, working on the things that motivate you, either as an individual or as a corporation, is a huge driver for development. So, how am I doing on time? A few more questions?
One or two?
Let's do 2 more questions. One at the back.
Do you see the 96 boards effort converging towards a place where we can do more reasonable things with our hardware?
I think 96 boards is doing okay. There's certainly been a lot of controversy over it. I'm a big fan. One of the boards in particular is very open, and we've got the ability to do work on code right up into all of the secure layers of the ARM processor.
Can we
So
get a shout out for them? So
that's the high silicon. Hey, I don't work for Lenaro anymore, so I can play favorites. I'm a big fan of the Huawei high silicon or high keyboard, because we've got access to all the security levels. We can write code for secure EL2. We can write code for EL3 right up into right from early boot. And I believe we can even burn the fuses on that part. So.
Actually, Grant, could you take a second and just tell the others
Oh,
who
sure.
may not be familiar what 96 boards
Okay,
is?
so 96 boards is a project that was started off by Lenaro. One of the challenges that Lenaro had right from when it started 5 years ago was they needed ARM hardware to work on, but every ARM silicon vendor came up with some different hardware that wasn't supported very well. So Lenaro came up with a specification for a couple of different types of board. One is a credit card sized consumer board. Another is an enterprise class server board. And the specification had some minimum requirements on, it had to have an open source kernel, it had on something either used by Android or mainline, it had some requirements on the bootloader. And then these boards that have been made by several different vendors are being used for developing the ARM ecosystem, to do support of ARM software. All right, well, I think I am out of time. So, thank you very much.